challenge and, if necessary, destroy the United before Samuele. It's now 9:10 p.m. in kind of a very grim Central Europe. Sorry for a rather late start, but kind of a domestic kitchen mishap, as is my woe. And so I got a little delayed because a lot of things kind of get messed up. But thank you very much, everybody who has joined me. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate your waiting. So obviously there's a lot going on, and we have this big EU meeting in Brussels today, and amidst a lot of very, very exciting. Oh my God, somebody said it's the audio. Let me.
All right. Is this better? Can people hear me now? Anyone? Could you hear me? That's better. Okay, so that's better. So what it required was a bit of the old rebooting. So yeah, your audio is a bit shady. It's a bit dodgy. I guess so. I guess so. But I don't know if it's exactly a microphone problem. It sounds more like a hardware problem. I mean, if I have to not reboot, but if I have to refresh the page, then it sounds like there's some issue with the computer. And somebody said here, Ivan Grozny, my good friend, says nothing gets George mad like the audio. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is absolutely frustrating because I feel like I'm speaking loudly, and people are saying we can't hear you. And you know, it's a very strange kind of experience when you speak loudly and people are saying I can't hear you. Then it just gets you a little mad. So, but anyway, hope that's issue has been sorted out. So today we have this big meeting in Brussels, in which all the Europeans are on board. All Europeans minus Viktor Orban and minus Robert Fico are on board with this plan to increase massively European military expenditures. Now, the strange thing, just on the surface, that all of this is being sold in the media as if, well, the Europeans are really letting Trump have it. You know, they're really maybe stepping up to the plate because now they can no longer rely on the United States. The days of the Americans are gone, and the Americans, have proven themselves to be fickle allies, and now the Europeans have to look after their own security, look after their own interests, and have to start spending their own money. Now, there's something very strange about that line of argument, because every American president, and most particularly Donald Trump, has urged the Europeans to spend more on their defense. Every single one. Now Trump, of course, raised the tone, raised the volume up a notch, but basically he wasn't saying anything that other presidents haven't said. So when the Europeans say, boy, we are now really, really, really going to step up and spend more on our military, then I don't quite understand how that's kind of sticking a finger in Trump's eye. That's exactly what Trump wanted you to do. Trump kind of, badgered and harassed and blustered in order to get you to spend more. And now you're saying you're going to do just that. You're going to spend more. And that's exactly what Trump wanted. Moreover, this is money. Most of this is going to go to the Americans because the Europeans don't really have any kind of a defense industry to speak of. So they will have to spend money on American military products. And again, that's all exactly as Trump wanted. So it was the same. It's rather the same with the sanctions. They imposed these sanctions on energy from Russia. We're not going to take your oil. We're not going to take your coal. We're not going to take your gas. So there, stick that, where the sun don't shine, Vladimir Putin. So what do they then do? They take all this energy and they buy it from the Americans at much higher prices, and it works very nicely for the Americans. So the more things go on, the more it seems like the whole thing, this rift, this transatlantic rift, was a con job, and it was done with a view to get the Europeans to spend more. Trump came in and said, "I want the Europeans to spend 5% of their GDP on defense." And then there were a lot of complaints and whining and whatnot. But now they're the ones who are saying, "Yeah, we're gonna go and absolutely spend more." And the UK Defense Secretary, man by the name of John Healey, is even as we speak in Washington, meeting the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and he is saying that, hey, we done just as you wanted us to do. President Trump wanted us to step up to the plate, and we're stepping up to the plate. Now, in that, given that this is exactly what the plan was from the start, then that you can start thinking about what this recent hysteria about Russia, what was that all about? Because on the face of it, when I say recent, I mean the hysteria that that we've heard in recent days. What was all that about? Well, you have to scare the European public into spending a lot more on defense. They weren't going to do it otherwise. They were absolutely not going to do it. I mean, it was hard enough to get them to spend 2% of GDP on defense. How the hell are you going to get it up to 5%? Well, the only way to do it is by scaring everyone by the Russian threat. So all of a sudden, all the European leaders, just the European leaders, not the Meg Galucci said, "You're from Baltimore." I didn't know you were from Baltimore. Okay, good to have friends in Baltimore. So all the European leaders are saying that we are now facing an existential threat from Russia. So there was nothing. This is for 3 years. The line was, we got to send all this hardware and all this money to Ukraine because Ukraine is in the forefront of this fight against Russia. And this, the more we send to Ukraine, the stronger it'll be at the negotiating table. So Ukraine will be in a really strong position vis-a-vis Russia at the negotiating table. So we've got to keep sending them money. And in any case, sanctions debilitating the Russian economy. And, Ursula von der Leyen famously said that so harsh and so painful have the sanctions been on Russia that the Russians are dismantling their dishwashers to get their microchips or whatever it was that they were getting from the dishwashers. But now the line has changed. Now every single European state is in danger from Russia. Russia now is about to unleash its hordes against Europe. And so, in that context, let me just show you Emmanuel Macron's truly a demented speech yesterday. He's addressed to the French nation. It's worth just taking a look at how insane it was. Where is this? Just a few highlights. He says the United States of America, our ally. Okay, let me just play from the current slide. The United States, our ally, has changed its position on this war, is less supportive of Ukraine, and is leaving doubts about what will happen next. At the same time, the United States of America intends to impose customs tariffs on products coming from Europe. And then finally, the world continues to become increasingly brutal, and the terrorist threat is not abating. And then he goes on that all right. Here's just going through the history. And beyond Ukraine, the Russian threat is there and affects the countries of Europe, affects us. Russia has already turned the Ukrainian conflict into a global conflict. It has mobilized North Korean soldiers and Iranian equipment on our continent. So that's two countries, while NATO comprises 32 countries, all or at least most of whom have provided some form of assistance to Ukraine. So that's but this it's a global conflict because there are some North Korean soldiers and some Iranian equipment on our continent, while helping those countries to arm themselves further. And President Putin's Russia violates our borders to assassinate opponents. So here that he's wheeling out the familiar trope about the Skripals. They violate our borders to assassinate opponents. And the various, at times when some Russians die, very shady Russians die, almost certainly because of some um, you know, uh, disputes among fellow gangster oligarchs. So, borders to assassinate opponents manipulates elections in Romania and Moldova. It organizes digital attacks on our hospitals to block their operation. I don't know what he's talking about. Why would Russia um, organize digital attacks on hospitals? I know what gains do you make by digitally attacking hospitals and manipulates elections in Romania and Moldova? That's very funny. I thought it was the Europeans who were manipulating elections in Romania and Moldova. I mean, they stole the Moldova election outright, and then in Romania they stole it again by canceling the second round of the presidential vote. So I don't know. The Russians are manipulating elections. I mean, yeah. Um, Russia tries to manipulate our opinions. Oh, and this is the old one about the RT. RT is manipulate our opinions with lies spread on social networks. It's so nice to have that old Putin's poisonous propaganda on our social networks. And deep down, it tests our limits, and it does it in the air, at sea, and space, and behind our screens. So they're everywhere. The Russians are absolutely everywhere. Wherever you look, under every bed, inside every living room, inside our television sets, they're in the movie screen. It's just amazing, um, given just how little presence Russia actually has in Europe. The only Russian president you have are these various Ukrainians who have left Ukraine over the past few years. And they're fairly ubiquitous in Europe, speaking Russian. They will speak Russian, not Ukrainian, um, and enjoying the comforts of refugee status, while they can actually come and go very freely to Ukraine, so that they enjoy all of the protections of refugees, while at the same time they're free to go back to Ukraine, attend to their business, see their friends and family, and then come back to whatever city they're residing in and enjoy their housing and job opportunities and so on. But that's the only kind of Russian presence that you have in Europe. Anyway, he goes on, this aggressiveness does not seem to know any borders, and at the same time, Russia continues to rearm, spending more than 40% of its budget for this purpose. By 2030, it plans to further increase its army to have 300,000 additional soldiers. Well, I mean, 300,000 isn't really that much. I mean, they're kind of bogged down in Ukraine in large part because they don't have an army large enough to win the war in Ukraine. I mean, to win a war like that, you're going to need an army of a couple of million, at least, to be able to ensure that your advantage in artillery and military vehicles, you know, to make sure that it actually counts. If you don't have the infantry to seize territory or strategic sites, then you're not going to win a war. And I think that's really been the tale of this the so-called special military operation. The Russia never had enough of an army in Ukraine to be able to win that war, and that's why it's gone on for more than 3 years now. 300,000 additional soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 300 more fighter jets. Again, that doesn't sound like a great deal. I mean, if it's only to people who don't know much about military matters think that that's an awful lot. That isn't a lot. 3,000 tanks. I mean, how many tanks have been destroyed so far? There have been thousands and more thousands of tanks that have been destroyed on both sides in this war, and fighter jets. Those get shot down very easily. Who can believe in this context that today's Russia will stop at Ukraine? Ah, yes. They won't stop at Ukraine. They haven't been able to take Donetsk, haven't been able to take Kherson and Zaporozhye, but apparently the Russians are not going to stop at Ukraine. Russia has become, at the same time as I speak to you, and for the years to come, a threat to France and to Europe. So that's it. So Russia is now a threat to France. That's interesting. So he starts off by saying how America is threatening Europe with tariffs, and that's a big threat to France. But now apparently, it's Russia that poses a threat to France. It's hard to see how exactly Russia does that. I mean, I guess with all this vague talk about assassinations and cyber attacks on hospitals and whatever, or RT and Russian social media, whatever, because I still don't get how does Russia pose a threat to France. But anyway, it says Russia has become, at the same time as I speak to you, and for a threat to France. I regret this very deeply, and I'm convinced that in the long term, peace will be made on our continent with a Russia that has become peaceful and calm again. We're going to make it peaceful and calm. We're going to pacify Russia. But the situation that I'm describing to you is that one, and we must deal with it. And then he goes on, faced with this world of dangers, remaining spectators would be madness. We can't remain spectators. We have to engager. We have to be engaged. It is a question without further delay of making decisions for Ukraine, for the security of the French, and for the security of the Europeans. So this is now, this on the heights of lunacy. Somehow, what happens in Ukraine is going to decide the destiny of France. Now, of course, if that's the case, and it bears repeating, if that is the case, if um, everything that happens in Ukraine somehow will determine the destiny of France, then you have to ask, why doesn't France then just simply go to war against Russia? I mean, absolutely, just said, like, say you got to go to war with Russia. I mean, if that is so vital, send your forces into Russia and fight Russia. Um, and yeah, just declare war on Russia, or just say Ukraine henceforth is a member of NATO, and that's it. And therefore, all member states of NATO will have to apply Article 5 and come to the rescue of Ukraine. But this is why this sort of bluster is so peculiar, because this you have this overheated talk about the threat of Russia and how Ukraine, everything's it's an existential matter for France. But then why is France staying out of it? I mean, no one is stopping Macron from declaring war on Russia and sending French forces to fight Russia in Ukraine, if it's that important. But of course, that's not really what they mean. I mean, this is all a bluster. It's all a massive con job, predicated on the assumption that the European public is very, very stupid, that they don't know anything, and then you can actually scare them into acting against their own interest and neglecting their own welfare, the blight of their cities, and all the conditions that they would like for their own lives, neglecting all of that in favor of sending money to Ukraine. That's it. So, we're going to raise taxes, or we're going to borrow money, and we're going to send it all to Ukraine because it's an existential matter. And who knows? I mean, maybe these things can work. I mean, if you go back and look at the COVID years, I mean, that went on, almost 2 years? 2 years it went on. You terrify the public into acting completely irrationally, wearing masks, even though everyone knows that masks don't work against the submicroscopic particles, staying at home, and everybody then reinfecting everybody else at home, and closing down businesses, so therefore causing huge economic problems in every country. And people bought into it. The governments terrified the public into acting in an obviously irrational way. And that's what's happening today in Europe. And Macron is the prime example. So anyway, but he doesn't stop with the lunacy here. Let me continue. So here, making decisions for Ukraine. For us, all initiatives that help peace are going in the right direction, and I want to welcome them this evening. We must continue to help the Ukrainians resist until they can negotiate with Russia a solid peace for themselves and for all of us. So it's for all of us. That is why the path to peace cannot involve abandoning Ukraine. Quite the contrary. Peace cannot be concluded at any price and under Russian diktat. Peace cannot be the capitulation of Ukraine. It cannot be its collapse, nor can it result in a ceasefire that would be too fragile. And why? Because here too we have experience from the past. We cannot forget that Russia began to invade Ukraine in 2014, that we then negotiated a ceasefire in Minsk, and that at the same time Russia did not respect the ceasefire, and that we were not able to maintain them due to lack of solid guarantees. Today, we can no longer take Russia at its word. Now, the thing about ridiculous statements like that is, well, who then killed the 13,000 residents of the Donbass in from 2014 to 2022. Since most of the residents of the Donbass are themselves ethnic Russians, that would mean that you'd have to say that the Russians were killing their own people, which doesn't make a great deal of sense. The killings were conducted by the government of Ukraine against its own people, the people of the Donbass, who had had the temerity of rejecting the coup regime, the regime that came to power upon overthrowing the illegal and legitimate government of Ukraine, namely, Viktor Yanukovych. And these people, the people in the Donbass, they formed his core support. That was absolutely his core constituency. He didn't get many votes in Western Ukraine. He didn't get, he got some votes in Central Ukraine. But when it came to Eastern Ukraine, that was his political stronghold. And they, perfectly reasonably, were not happy at having their choice overturned undemocratically for the second time, because the same thing happened in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. Again, they voted for Yanukovych. Yanukovych won that election, and then that election was cancelled. And then in 2014, then you had a coup, and again Yanukovych was overthrown. So that's the origins of that that war. So here, Macron absolutely lying, and then he goes on with his terrifying his audience that Ukraine has the right to peace and security for itself, and it is in our interest, the interest of the security of the European continent. It is in this sense that we are working with our British, German friends and several other European countries. This is why you saw me in recent weeks gathering several of them in Paris, going to meet them a few days ago in London to consolidate the commitments necessary for Ukraine. Once peace is signed, so that Ukraine is not invaded again by Russia, we must prepare for it. This will certainly involve supporting the Ukrainian army over the long term. So that's they have a peace is signed, and you're actually going to go in and support the Ukrainian army. So in other words, you're going to be preparing its military for the next round of fighting. Once peace is signed, then in theory, all nations' resources should be dedicated to the reconstruction of the country. But no, apparently we're going to go in and support the Ukrainian army over the long term. So we're going to be building up the Ukrainian army. For what exactly? It will also perhaps involve deploying European forces. These would not go to fight today. They would not go to fight on the front line, but would be there, on the contrary, once peace is signed, to guarantee full respect for it. But that's the point. If you're there, whether you're on the front line or in the back line, you're building a military infrastructure. It was precisely the construction of a NATO military infrastructure that triggered the start of the so-called special military operation. That was what they objected to. Because if you were just going to bring in, let's say, you bring in peacekeepers. Okay, let's say you bring peacekeepers. Okay, you can have peacekeepers, and every peacekeeper will have no more weapons other than for their own personal security. Okay, everyone can have a revolver. You have a revolver in your pocket, and that's it. There's no other. That isn't what Macron is saying. We're not talking about people just having a handgun in order to protect themselves. They are talking about building a NATO military infrastructure, military bases, air bases, missile defense systems, anti-aircraft missiles, and of course all road transport, logistics, infrastructure, all constructed. Something that they did in Kosovo. And if you remember, at the time of the Kosovo, which was out during the Rambouillet negotiations, when they said, "Oh, we're going to have a NATO force in Kosovo," Milosevic said, well, "Okay, you can send in your peacekeepers, and and even they can be there. We can even have NATO peacekeepers, but they can't have more than armaments with them, other than just personal handguns. That's it, just for their own personal security." NATO flatly rejected that because, of course, what they intended was to send in the tanks and construct their all their military bases, which is what they did. And they're there in Kosovo to this day. Camp Bondsteel, that was built by the Americans, the biggest army base in Europe, and that's the plan. Now Macron seems to think everybody's really stupid, and they're gonna and people are gonna buy it, just like they think they're stupid, and they're gonna think that somehow Russia poses some sort of a threat to France. And at the same time, we're going to go into Ukraine, long-term commitment to the Ukrainian army, and that the Russians are going to accept this. Meg Galucci, I always like Meg's comments. How will we ever get rid of NATO? Hopeless. I agree with you, and I'm kind of more pessimistic now than ever, because the more I more and more I'm coming to the conclusion that that we're being played. We're being played for suckers by the Trump administration and the Europeans. They're putting on a Punch and Judy show, but the end result is more NATO, more forces, more spending on the military. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is by cutting back on all the sort of the social perks that the Europeans have been used to. Now, obviously, the Europeans are not very happy about it. They're not going to be happy about this. I mean, when you think of the United Kingdom, you think of sort of London and the southeast, which is very, very prosperous. No question, that is extremely prosperous. And if you go there, you think, well, what a wealthy country. And but the rest of the country, up in the north and the Midlands, that is grim. That's almost third world life there. We saw it. I mean, when we saw the riots last summer over the killings in Southport, over the killings of those 3 little girls, you just saw it. That's the UK, not the fancy apartments, luxury condos in London, which is what we normally think of as the UK. No, that's that urban blight. That's the UK. So no spending on any of that. But we're going to spend it on arms. So Starmer declared that he wants to go for 2.5% of GDP. He wants to do it within the next couple of years. And Kemi Badenoch, who's the new Tory party leader, says that's not enough. We're going to move to 3.5% of GDP. So that's the opposition, the Tory opposition. 2.5% of GDP is not enough. We've got to spend to 3.5%. Why? Because of the Russian threat. Anyway, let's just go on for a bit more with Macron. And so here we have, starting next week, we will bring together in Paris the chiefs of staffs of the countries that wish to take responsibility in this regard. This is a plan for a solid, lasting, verifiable peace that we have prepared with the Ukrainians and several European partners, and that I defended in the United States 15 days ago and across Europe. And I want to believe that the United States will remain at our side, but we must be ready if this is not the case. Imagine the United States is going to abandon us. And then whether peace in Ukraine is achieved quickly or not, European states must, given the Russian threat that I have just described to you, be able to defend themselves better and deter any new aggression. Yet whatever happens, we must equip ourselves better, raise our defense positions, and this for the sake of peace itself, to deter. In this respect, we remain attached to NATO and our partnership with the United States, but we must do more to strengthen our independence in terms of defense and security. The future does not have to be decided in Washington or Moscow. And yes, the threat is returning to the East, and the innocence of the last 30 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall is now over. So the Russian threat is here. And this is where it gets interesting. He says here, so in this time of action that is finally beginning, France has a special status. We have the most effective army in Europe, and thanks to the choices made by our elders after the Second World War, we are equipped with nuclear deterrence capabilities. This protects us much more than many of our neighbors. In addition, we did not wait for the invasion of Ukraine to note a worrying world, and through the 2 military programming laws that I decided to on. But where is it? Then he goes on. Our nuclear deterrent protects us. It is complete, sovereign, French from the start to finish. Since 1964, it has always explicitly played a role in preserving peace and security in Europe. But in response to the historic call of the future German Chancellor, I have decided to open the strategic debate on the protection of our allies on the European continent through our deterrent. Whatever happens, the decision has always been and will remain in the hands of the President of the Republic. Now, what happened was this: the future German Chancellor, or the one who's likely to take over very shortly, Friedrich Merz, who clearly is just far more demented than the outgoing Sergeant Schultz is. Absolutely rabid when it comes to Russia, where Schultz at least tried to be equivocal. But here we have Merz saying, yeah, I think France and presumably the UK should extend their nuclear umbrella to cover Germany. Now, that's it's very problematic because, in the first place, the British nuclear deterrent isn't in any way an independent deterrent. It's in the hands of the Americans. And so the British can't use the Trident other than with the approval of the Americans. So that's one problem. The second problem is that what Macron is saying is clearly outrageously false, because the French, when the French developed, acquired nuclear weapons, which the Americans weren't very happy with, but the French acquired these nuclear weapons. Their doctrine was that the nuclear weapons can only be used in one circumstance at all, and that is if France itself is under immediate threat. In other words, it's a weapon of last resort, only to be used if France itself is under threat. So I don't know how you can then ignore that and start to use it for Germany. Moreover, I'm not at all sure that the German public will actually go for it. I mean, the German public is quite mistrustful of France. I mean, they don't particularly, not that fond of the French, and they don't really want to separate themselves from the Americans. They never have. I mean, this has been, this is an ongoing thing. De Gaulle started it first. That he made entreaties to the Germans and said, why don't you sort of start separating yourself from the Americans and become, more closely aligned with us. And again, even de Gaulle brought up the issue of these nuclear weapons, and the Germans were not buying it at all. Absolutely not. They absolutely always turned the French down. And while Merz is clearly departing from that German tradition. I don't think the German public is. I think German public would much rather stick with the Americans than to go with the French. They do not trust the French to provide them with any kind of a nuclear guarantee. Now, speaking of Merz, this is very interesting because now Merz and Sergeant Schultz have agreed again on a massive increase in German defense expenditure, which again the media are absolutely excited and delighted by. Why Germany spending more on armaments is such great news, but nonetheless, Scholz and Merz have said that we are going to get rid of the debt brake. The debt brake means the deficit has to be a certain proportion of the GDP. It can't rise above as a percentage of the GDP. I can't remember. It's something like 0.35% of GDP. That's according to the German constitution. So now we're going to get rid of it, so that any defense expenditure, I think, in excess of 1% of GDP will not count towards the debt brake. That's in other words, we can spend whatever we want on defense, and that doesn't count towards the debt. It just doesn't. I mean, we're just not going to count any of that as debt. So that's kind of interesting. That Germany, which has always been the model of financial rectitude, particularly with its terribly painful memories of the great inflation of 1923 and what that led to. So Germany has always been a model of financial rectitude, and now said, well, we're going to abandon our tight fiscal discipline, and we're just going to splurge on defense. Now, the bond markets have reacted very, very negatively to this, and because essentially, I mean, basically they're realizing that Germany is going to be spending an awful lot of money, is going to be borrowing enormous amounts of money, and so therefore, holders of German government bonds have been dumping bonds. So the price of bonds have been declining, which means yields have been rising. And what does that mean? When yields are rising, it means the cost of borrowing is rising. And so therefore the bond market is giving a very negative response to this, and telling the German government that this is going to cost you an enormous amount of money to fund this deficit. So you already have this very negative reaction to this Merz-Scholz program for massive increases in military expenditures. The Europeans don't really have the kind of flexibility that the Americans have, because the Americans have their reserve currency, and then basically they can always get around all of the fiscal strictures. But here, the Europeans, so even if they say, well, we're going to change the constitution, and henceforth any defense expenditure in excess of 1% of GDP will not count towards the debt. You're still going to have to borrow money, and you can see that the bondholders are very, very unhappy, and clearly the bond prices are going down, and that means yields are rising, which means that the bondholders are going to expect a great amount of return on their bonds, which means that the German government is going to have to borrow that much more in order to finance its these deficits. So that's the German plan. So the British, you have Kemi Badenoch, this strange person who's this Nigerian woman who is aspiring to be prime minister of the UK. Can you imagine sort of an Englishman aspiring to be president of Nigeria? I can't. Anyway, it seems so strange. And now we got Macron talking about this huge increases in armaments, and then extending the nuclear umbrella to Germany and presumably to the rest of Europe. You've got the German government abandoning, its reputation for fiscal rectitude. It's been this pride, the pride of Germany, that it absolutely is rigid on when it comes to deficits and debt. It was not going to have anything that is inflationary. We'll never go down that path. So here, so drastic is this step by the Scholz-Merz team, that even countries in Europe that are usually aligned with Germany, all those various Scandinavians, these rich Scandinavians. Well, is it? I don't know. Wait, I'm talking about like the Dutch. No, it's not really Scandinavians. Anyway, like the Belgians and the Dutch and the Luxembourgers. They're saying, hey, we're not very happy about this. I mean, if Germany abandons its, this financial probity, what's going to happen to the rest of Europe? I mean, Europe was dedicated to this financial discipline. We're suddenly we're going to be like the third world. That's not the plan. But that seems to be where the Scholz-Merz team is heading. Anyway, it was quite interesting then. So just to go on with Macron, because he said all this, and then the Russians responded, and the Russian response was very lengthy, but not uninteresting. So here we have. On the eve of the EU summit dedicated to the crisis around Ukraine and the confrontation with Russia, French President Emmanuel Macron, clearly trying to set the tone for the upcoming meeting, made an extremely aggressive anti-Russian speech, having once again called our country a threat to France and Europe. He accused it, as usual, without any evidence, of all mortal sins, from cyber attacks and interference in elections to the desire to almost attack other European states. Yeah, that's what Macron said. The French president convinces his own citizens of the existence of an imaginary existential threat from Russia. In fact, Russia has never threatened France, but on the contrary, helped to defend its independence and sovereignty in 2 world wars. But Emmanuel Macron's statements are, in fact, a threat to Russia. That is very interesting because when Macron says, the threat is returned from the East, it's actually very strange because France and Russia have traditionally been allies. Admittedly, they did fight at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. But again, it was France that invaded Russia. It wasn't really Russia invading France. Eventually, of course, once Napoleon was defeated, then of course Tsar Alexander entered Paris triumphantly in 1814. But that was because of Napoleon. I mean, it was Napoleon who launched this attack on Russia. But it is true, in World War I and World War II, France and Russia were allies. And Russians, I think, rightly say, well, when were these threats? And then you've got the De Gaulle era, when de Gaulle essentially was trying to create a what was the phrase that he used? Was it, I don't know, from something to the Urals, Europe's, I don't know, from so there was, he wanted to create this united Europe. Death says, I like Alexander the Third. Okay, well, each to his own. Alexander the Third actually was quite a good Tsar. He was the one who succeeded his father, who was assassinated, Alexander the Second. So Alexander the Third was a good Tsar. The one problem with Alexander the Third was, of course, the anti-Jewish pogroms, which really damaged Russia's reputation. That was Russia's reputation has never really recovered from that. I mean, a lot of it, no, I mean, some of it has been wildly exaggerated, and Russia has got an unfair bad rap as a result. I mean, I think it wasn't as terrible as as people would like to make out, but nonetheless, there was a program against the Jews under Alexander the Third. Solzhenitsyn writes about that in his book about Russians and Jews, which is together 200 years or whatever it was called. But that was still Anyway, Alexander Third. But the point is that if you think about World War I and World War II, Russia took a hit. Absolutely took a hit in fighting against Germany in World War One, and so much so that it led to the Bolshevik Revolution, and essentially in its fight against Germany. It was a hopeless fight. Russia did it in order to relieve some of the pressure on France on the Western Front. I mean, that's the French asked the Russians essentially to relieve the pressure. Otherwise, France would just be overwhelmed by the Germans, and that did. But Russia suffered huge defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg in September 1914. So that Russia did that for France. And then, of course, in World War II, Russia, Stalin, he didn't have to do anything for France. I mean, France had been defeated. The Red Army had basically broken the back of the Wehrmacht, and there was really no reason to do anything for France. And yet, nonetheless, the Soviet Union launched an offensive, Operation Bagration, to help the Western Allies on the Western Front during the D-Day invasion. It was a massive operation by the Red Army, precisely to relieve some of the pressure on the Western armies trying to liberate France. Stalin didn't have to do that, but they did it. And then to allow France to become a great power after World War II, to become one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, to get its own zone of occupation in Germany. That was Stalin. Stalin could have said no to all of that. He owed France nothing. So it's not a good idea for Macron to talk about the threat from the East. So the Russians sound aggrieved with some reason. Anyway, let's go on with this. The French leader appeals to the foreign policy traditions of his country, but his theses run counter to these traditions, to the ideological legacy of Gaullism. He cannot help but know that France's authority in the international arena has been based for decades on the desire of his predecessors to play a balancing role in world affairs, to make a feasible contribution to reducing tensions between Russia and the West. At one time, it was Charles de Gaulle who put forward the concept of indivisible from the Atlantic to the Urals. I couldn't remember what is the Atlantic to the Urals. I was there. The concept of indivisible security from the Atlantic to the Urals, based on the development of consensus, taking into account the opinions and interests of all states on the continent. Today, we are witnessing a break between official Paris and these fundamental principles of French foreign policy. Macron's speech is permeated with the theme of providing security guarantees for Ukraine and not a word about security guarantees for Russia. But it is precisely the absence of such guarantees, the constant creation of threats to our country by the West, primarily through the unrestrained expansion of NATO, contrary to the promises given, the desire to turn Ukraine into an anti-Russian bridgehead that led to the current crisis. Western leaders, including Macron himself, have been warned about this many times over the years. Once again, we are convinced that Paris still does not intend to take into account the vital interests of our country and is aimed at forcing it to make decisions that the West needs. Is there anything else? What path of peace does the French leader propose? The recipes are the same. Further pumping Ukraine with Western weapons, yes, and continuing military actions, an unprecedented increase in military spending by European, NATO, and EU member states. In this context, accusation against Russia of increasing military appropriations and the number of armed forces seem absurd. After all, the combined military budget of NATO countries is twice as large as the defense spending of all other countries in the world. And the military budget of EU states is several times larger than Russia's defense spendings. And then, as for the ideas promoted by Emmanuel Macron of deploying Western military contingents on Ukrainian territory under the guise of peacekeeping forces, we have repeatedly stated that this is unacceptable. Such an occupation of Ukraine would inevitably lead to an extremely dangerous escalation. And then, the speech leaves a feeling of awkwardness for Emmanuel Macron himself, who is trying to appear as a new leader of the free world. It is indicative of how the current European elites have become petty and embittered. The contours of normalization in Russia and the United States, which have only just begun to emerge, and the movement towards a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis are causing them real panic, and so on. So understandable that the Russians are clearly unhappy. However, I think they are being very optimistic about the intentions of the Trump administration, because in many ways everything is now unfolding much as Trump wanted. I mean, Trump wanted the Europeans to take seriously the spending on military hardware. The Europeans are doing it. They've done absolutely what Trump wanted them to do, but they've had to do it by ratcheting up the hysteria about Russia. That's the only way they can get the public to support this. So everything, the Britain, which is a basket case in so many ways, is now going to move up to 2.5%, 3.5% of expenditure. Germany is abandoning all of its fiscal caution. So all of this has come in response to Trump. Now, I don't fully know exactly what's on Trump's mind when it comes to a peace in Ukraine. I mean, I know he says he wants peace, but he doesn't sound to me as if he's really thought anything about what would be acceptable to him, other than somehow an immediate end to the war, which I don't think is feasible. I mean, Russia will then not have achieved its goals, and Ukraine will essentially have accepted the loss of territory, which I don't think it can be done, because Ukraine, I mean, any leader of Ukraine who's just going to accept the loss of 20% of the country is not long for this world. He will be assassinated very quickly. So it's hard to see how you can you can get some kind of a peace agreement on that basis. But however, the news broke late today that there will be a meeting between the United States and Ukraine in Saudi Arabia on March the 11th. So March the 11th, that would be next Tuesday. So next Tuesday, a meeting between the Americans and the Ukrainians. I mean, my feeling is that Trump doesn't see this war in Ukraine as in any way serving American interests. I think he probably has decided that the war has done for America about the maximum that it could do. I think it's fatally. I mean, it's damaged. I think Russia's reputation as a great power. I think it's going to be very hard to go back to the pre-22 era when we'd become convinced that somehow Russia is almost the equal of the United States. I think that's going to be difficult to restore that reputation. But I think Trump probably feels that whatever the Americans got out of it is now is about the maximum. There's nothing more. It's obviously led to the death of many Russians, so it's already inflicted heavy losses on the Russian people. It's damaged Russia's reputation, and Trump, I think, wants Russia to use Russia for other purposes. Obviously, the most important of which is China. He's got clearly China in his sights. He wants to downgrade and defeat China economically. I mean, so there's I think that clearly he just wants to make sure that China. I think he wants to force China into signing some kind of an economic agreement that would mean essentially China's acceptance of being number two in the world, permanently number two in the world, and not to try to rival the United States as the leading economic power in the world. I think that's what he's after. I think he's going to wage a trade war and probably start applying serious pressure against China in order to force it to come to some kind of economic accommodation with the United States. And I think and Trump wants Russia on board. I mean, that's not necessarily as any kind of an ally of the United States. I think Trump probably feels that he doesn't need Russia, but he doesn't want Russia and China together. He doesn't want the two of them becoming ever closely enmeshed together, which hasn't actually happened. But that's he wants to at least separate them. They're not going to go to war. They're not going to be enemies. They're not going to be adversaries or anything like that. That's all nonsense. But he kind of wants them at least to not to be so close to each other. So I think that's Trump. That I think clearly is the Trump plan when it comes to China. Trump obviously also wants to deal once and for all with the Iranian problem. I recorded a podcast about that yesterday. Because I think he clearly the Trump administration has put out feelers to the Russians to essentially apply pressure on Iran to essentially abandon its nuclear program or to bring itself under full Western control. So basically, it's going to be under Western tutelage to make sure that Iran follows the Western guidance. I think that's the American plan, because it's not. There's no evidence Iran ever had a nuclear weapons program, or if it did, it gave it up a long time ago. But I think he would like to apply further pressure against Iran, and thereby, basically eliminate Iran as any kind of a power in the Middle East. So it will just be revert back to the old days when he was under Western tutelage, and he would follow policies dictated to it by the West. So in other words, it may still be the Islamic Republic, but in effect, Iran will go back to the days of the Shah, when it did as it was told by the West. I think that's the Trump plan. I think he's in. I think he wants Russia to help, and I think clearly the Russians seem to be quite open to this offer from Trump. And I think, as I think Judy Hotchkiss pointed out, and is that there's also the issue of Greenland, and the Arctic, and getting Russian help with icebreakers to exploit the Arctic. I think that's also part of the plan. So Trump has uses for Russia, but none of it involves accepting Russia as in any way a great power. I just don't think Trump thinks of it that. I mean, I think that moment has passed for the time being, anyway. However, none of these things can happen unless this war is brought to an end, and that's the part that I find difficult to see how that can happen. So and I the so anyway, that is the plan, and now let me take a look at the Gaggle locals page, which is where the Gagglers congregate and help me navigate my life, dealing with these dogs who always unhappy with me over, by the condition of the tip jar, which is somehow my responsibility, and the dogs, blame me for everything. So, so thank you for the Gagglers who try to help me out, and so that they can, I have something to present to the dogs and say, look, I mean, I did what I could. Anyway, Peter Nolan, good to see you, says, hi, George and all. I hope everyone is fit and well. Thank you. Good to see you again. Dale Owens, also very good to see you. Haven't seen you in a while, but very nice to see you again. And Dale says, so the streets of UK are threatened by the Russians. Really? I like that one. But who are they really threatened by? Now let me think. That's exactly right. I mean, everything that we've seen in the UK is just shows how much neglect the Britain is now suffering from the the elites in Westminster. London and the southeast in very nice shape. It's one of the wealthiest, most salubrious parts in the world. Once you get out of London, I think it's a very different order there. And of course what you say, guess the mass immigration, the rape gangs, the grooming gangs, and all of that has been introduced into the UK knowingly by successive governments. They knew exactly what they were doing. They made no attempt to stop it. Those who complained about it got whacked over the head, punished by the law, and people just being asked to swallow it. And here's Starmer, who has ignored all of that, and is now trying to persuade the British that Russia poses some kind of a threat to them. I mean, can you imagine sort of the idiocy of that? But I have to ask: can this be successful? And in my more pessimistic moments, which are much more frequent than optimistic moments, I think maybe it can be successful. Maybe they will absolutely, using the propaganda machine of the media, the BBC, and the rest, Sky News, using all that, they will persuade the British people that Russia poses some kind of a threat to them. I mean, every time I watch CNN or when there's MSNBC or whatever, they're just telling us what this dire threat Russia poses. They, quite how a country that's making very little progress in Ukraine after 3 years is actually going to reach the English Channel. I mean, that's never explained, because there's a constant just whipping up of this hysteria about Russia, and therefore, when you whip up hysteria, there's no room for anyone to step in and try to calm things down and offer any reasoned arguments. So anyway, and then, all right, so Ivan Grozny says, gonna be honest, Trump is a bit pissy lately. Either do the tariffs or don't. Yep. But this is accomplishing nothing other than tanking my retirement. I kind of agree with you, because the point about tariffs is that they make sense if they are deployed in a strategic way. I mean, if you say these are the goals I want to reach, these are the industries that I want to protect, these are the industries that I want to advance because they're crucial to our country's security, then I think tariffs make sense. But what he's doing here is just using tariffs in this haphazard way of squabbling with other countries. And that seems to be completely pointless. I mean, they say, well, I'm going to impose tariffs because you failed to do this, this, and this. And then, some political leader gets on the phone and says, well, look, I mean, we've done this, and it's not true. We look how we've cracked down on fentanyl, and we've cracked down on the on the drug lords and all the rest. Oh, all right. Well, if you put it like that, we'll hold off on the tariffs. That doesn't achieve anything. I mean, well, that's just simply antagonizing countries unnecessarily. So I absolutely agree. Either you're going to do tariffs, or you're not going to do tariffs, but you can't use them in this haphazard way of just annoying countries, and then if they accept your demands, then you lift the tariffs. I mean, that's not going to get you anywhere. So the way he's doing it doesn't make any sense at all. He led people to believe that he was going to do tariffs in the strategic way that the Germans did. Under Bismarck, they used tariffs in a strategic way to build up their industry. The way America did in its history, the Alexander Hamilton, essentially to develop your industry, develop your agriculture behind high protective walls. That makes sense. But just simply using them in order to cajole others, that makes no sense. It just creates bad feeling. Marks 2023 says, John Helmer was on Dialogue Works. He said Trump's ratings for the first 4 weeks are the worst in history in such a short time. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think that he's still doing reasonably well in the polls. I don't know if he's going to continue with that. But according to some polls, he's in negative territory. But there are some polls in which you're saying he's still in positive territory. So it's not immediately obvious that he's doing poorly. I think the things that he's embarked on have so far are quite popular. I mean, the whole idea that people don't like cracking down on federal government, I think it's just not true. I think people want government to be brought under control. Republicans have been promising to do this in decades. They've never done it. Every single Republican on the election hustings says, yeah, we're going to, trim the fat, we're going to cut the size of government. And when they get to power, government just keeps growing. So, so when Trump is seemingly taking it seriously, I don't think that's unpopular. I don't know how this is going to fare, though, because the courts are stepping in, and he's getting into a fight with the courts, and that could drag on for some time. And he's not really winning these cases in the courts, so that could become a problem for him. And I think his policy on Ukraine is popular. I think cracking down on migrants coming into the country, deportations to the extent that he's been able to do deportations, which are not at all easy. That's, I think, popular. Um, the tariffs, I mean, as we said, um, I would normally say, well, we need to wait and see whether the tariffs are working, whether he's achieving anything with the tariffs. But um, if he's going to do tariffs in this haphazard way, I think that is going to become unpopular. I mean, he's saying, oh well, I'm going to impose this on Mexico, and then, oh well, all right, I'll give them one more month, and then he said, well, that's it, the tariffs go into effect as of midnight, and then, oh, all right, I'll give you one more month. I mean, I think that goes down very badly. That will without doubt be unpopular. And then, of course, you've got the issue of Gaza. If Trump intends to get America sucked into another war in the Middle East, that is going to go down like a like a rock. That's going to be very, very unpopular. Nobody at all wants that. So and that it's seemingly he's going down that path of a war in Gaza. So boy, he will lose his popularity very quickly then. So um, I think at this stage it's far too early to say. And he's been active in other kinds of ways. I think making English an official language, that's going to be popular. Keeping men out of women's sports, that's popular. Um, so something renaming Gulf of Mexico as Gulf of America, whatever you might think of it, I think that'll be popular. Mount McKinley, popular. So I think he's doing things, and again, making America energy independent, popular. So it's too early, I think, to say. But I think there are perils down the road. I think he's not handling the tariffs well. I think he's getting sucked into the war in Gaza. I mean, the cracking down on universities, that's probably popular, but no one likes these Ivy League or fancy universities. But he's doing it on the wrong for the wrong reason, namely that they're tolerating alternative views on Palestine. Um, so, Anne Marie, always very good to see you. So thank you so much for your generosity. And says, good evening, George and Gagglers. Thank you very much, George, for the 2 updates from yesterday. Really very interesting and insightful. Thank you so much, Anne Marie. I really appreciate your words. And I urge Gagglers to listen to the contribution this week for the Gaggle Music Club, which is Scriabin's, and then read Anne Marie's very insightful observations about the piece. Anne Marie is, of course, herself professional musician, so she comes to it with the experience of somebody who plays music and who has played Scriabin, who is not at all an easy composer to play. So everybody should go, listen to the music and enjoy Anne Marie's observations about it. Marx 2023 says, George, the UK political system is a uniparty. Only the Workers' Party are independent. Well, yeah. But the problem is that the Workers' Party has no hope whatsoever of getting anywhere. Galloway, has basically one method, and that is the through by-elections. By-elections, People are protest, people are angry, and they vote for a third, fourth, fifth party. And then you're in parliament for a short while, and then the general election comes, and then people go back to voting for Labour or Tories. Now Farage, his reform has made a breakthrough, and now according to the polls, it's the number one party in the UK. But we'll see whether that continues. I'm not at all sure that Farage is doing particularly well. I think he's too eager to be respectable. And so he also may turn out to be a flash in the pan at the next general election. Far from making a breakthrough, he could just simply collapse from 5 MPs to maybe 1 or 2 MPs. Maybe he alone will survive. So I hope not. I hope reform will become a major force in the UK. But it's that political system is awfully hard to break through. I mean, it's just in every constituency to be able to become a force in Parliament. In just about every constituency, you need to win, or at least I don't know, it's at least 60, 70 constituencies. You have to win something like 40% of the vote. That's a tall order for a new party on the scene. So. And anyway, Marx 2023 says the European armies are not capable of combined arms warfare. The armies are there to be used against their own populations. Well, that may be, and I don't think this is going to happen because the sums involved. I mean, to become serious military powers are just basically the Europeans don't have that money. I mean, there is a reason why the UK has allowed its military to be completely run down, because they basically they never wanted to spend any money on this. So that's why the UK has almost non-existent military. Which it's very similar in France. France is there's a little bit bigger military than the UK, but it's much the same. The German military is a joke. Most European countries' military is a joke. For them to take this seriously, to start spending serious sums, they're all going to have to cut back drastically their welfare states that they've become used to, and they're going to have to start raising taxes on their populations. So I don't think, I don't think it's doable. I mean, they can whip up hysteria in the way Macron and Merz are doing, and Starmer, but the money isn't there. Even Thatcher didn't do this. And she was as hawkish as the next person, because ultimately it's the whole of that defense military model that Europe has based on is that we don't spend any money on the military. We rely on the Americans. That's why we all want to be part of NATO, because we want to rely on the Americans. So when Macron said and Merz say, well, that's it, we're not going to rely on the Americans anymore, we're going to dip into our own pockets and start spending serious money, I think it's just it's ludicrous. And the bond market, as I was saying earlier, has already spoken out about this and said, that they're very unpersuaded by the economic feasibility of this. Marty, always very good to see you. Thank you so much, Marty, as always, for your generosity. Happy Thursday, George and Gagglers. Thank you. And then Vic Shakapopoulos says, George, who is your favorite comedian? That's a very interesting one. I think if you go back several generations, I think I was always a huge fan of the Marx Brothers. Big fan. Most of their films I really liked. I mean, some of the later films when they were already getting a little old, I wasn't a great fan of. But in their heyday, they were really good. Um, when you come to more recent times, um, I have to say, I have to admit, I did think that Seinfeld in its heyday was very funny. I mean, even when you see these clips now, and they were very funny. They managed to tap into something interesting, and it took a little while for them to get going. I think their early seasons were not particularly impressive, but once they hit their stride, I think they really were quite innovative in their comedy. Um, I think Larry David, who was obviously the creator of Seinfeld and was I guess the driving force of Seinfeld. I wasn't that impressed with the show that he did. Curb Your Enthusiasm. Maybe a few of the early seasons were pretty good, but he became very, very tiresome because he only had one track, Larry David. That is, here I am. I'm a very rich guy. I've made billions. I don't have to do a stroke of work ever again. I can just go around being thoroughly obnoxious to everybody. Now, that's can be funny for a little while, but it does get very, very annoying after a while because essentially here is somebody who's a billionaire and he's being obnoxious to with people who are not billionaires. So he's constantly bullying waiters, shop assistants, um, uh, hairdressers. That's the humor. Well, why are you doing this? I mean, you have so much money. You don't need any more money. You don't need to do a stroke of work ever again. So why are you getting into fights with car park attendants? And the way he presents it as if he's the reasonable one, and the car park attendant who lives off tips is the one who is unreasonable. And so after a while, it not only does it cease to be funny, it just becomes really quite repugnant. And there's, you think this is quite a repulsive person. And I think the last season of his that I saw, where he got into some kind of a fight, a competition with a coffee shop owner, Mocha Joe, and you think, why, you're a billionaire, you made all this, I mean, you don't need anything, and you're trying to drive out of business some poor schnook who just who does nothing else in life. However, unpleasant this person may be, all he does in life is he owns a coffee shop, and you're getting into a fight with him. So that was like, so. But as I say, I mean, I thought that Seinfeld um, was quite funny. Anyway, uh, um, thank you, Vic Shakopoulos, for the question. Marx 2023 says, George, are you of the opinion that Stalin was not a Bolshevik? Well, I think he was a Bolshevik, but I think that what was interesting about him was that unlike other Bolsheviks, he did seem to have a certain respect and admiration for the Russian people, the Russian nations. Other Bolsheviks, they were filled with their ideology, the kind of what one would call these days the kind of globalist ideology, communism, the proletarian revolution, and all the rest. But Stalin, I think, did, particularly after World War II, did acquire a respect for the Russian people with his famous toast in 1945, when he drank a toast to the Russian people that he said are the greatest nation um, in the USSR. And he opened the churches, he opened the monasteries, and he never closed them. He opened them during World War II, but he never closed them in his lifetime. He was the persecution of the Orthodox Church only resumed after Stalin's death. So I'd say he was a Bolshevik, but he did seem to have this fondness for Russia, and even in the discussion with Lenin as to what shape would the Soviet Union take, Stalin's view was that the republics, that all the various republics, like whether it's Ukraine or Georgia or Kazakhstan or whatever, these would be republics of Russia. So it would be similar to the Russian Empire, but these would be republics of Russia, independent republics within Russia, which Russia has, like all the various Tatarstan and so on. And that was Stalin's idea, but it was Lenin's view, which was to create this union of Soviet socialist republics, so they would all that these republics were essentially independent. Theoretically they were independent, but they were united within this USSR, which again at the time may not have been that significant, but it was clearly Lenin's view that prevailed over Stalin's view. But it did become significant in later years as these republics gradually became more and more distant from the center, with local creatures building up, feathering their nests in these republics. That when somebody like Gorbachev came along, that was the moment when they decided to make their move and just break away from the USSR. So I think Stalin's view was probably the correct one, which was that there should have republics of whether independent or autonomous republics of Russia, and that might have kept the Soviet Union together. But as it was, when Gorbachev just sort of lifted everything from the central control gradually evaporated, then boom, the republics. There was nothing really to keep the republics within the common state. So Stalin was a Bolshevik, but he did have some real Russian nationalist traits, though he was a Georgian rather, and therefore not really a Russian. Whereas the Russian communists, including of course Lenin, they despised and detested Russia. Laura says, did Lavrov say something about Trump, Vance, and Hegseth asking Europe an unprecedented increase in military spending, just as Macron is proposing? I didn't see that Lavrov said anything. I mean, the line coming from Moscow now, and you saw some of that in that press release talking about Macron, is that we're getting on well with Trump. We have good relations with Trump, but we don't have good relations with the Europeans. So if Lavrov said anything today about Trump and Vance and Hegseth, I'm sure it'll be along the lines that these are people, serious, mature people that we can do business with, and they're sincere in wanting peace, and we can work with them, but we can't work with these Russophobic hysterics in Europe, which may be true. We'll have to see. Whether they will be able to do business with Trump, Vance, and Hegseth. So, but the line at the moment from Moscow is, we're not going to say anything mean. We're just going to be very nice, very polite, very respectful to the Trump administration. Anyway, Laura goes on. 5 years from now, Russians can say that they were led by the nose when they accepted Trump's peace deal. I tend to And I tend to think that that's what may well happen. I hope not. I absolutely hope not. I hope that that's not going to happen. Um, but there are, this when they sound so positive, about Trump, they kind of forget Trump is not on your team. He's not interested in doing anything for Russia. He has no fondness whatever for Russia. He may well want this war to come to an end. He has his own reasons for wanting this war to come to an end, but he's not in the business of doing any favors for Russia. So if the Russians think that they're going to get something, and then they can somehow trust him and do a deal, give up on their wartime goals, because Trump and Vance seem to be friendly and respectful to them and want to make use of them for other things. Hey, well, what about exploring the Arctic together? Hey, what about trying to lean on Iran? And what's next? Hey, we'd like maybe North Korea to demilitarize or denuclearize. Maybe you can help us there as well. So, chances are that within a few years, it will be. We were led by the nose, because Trump, it's the same Trump who, after all, began the dispatch of lethal weapons to Ukraine. Obama, and the Russians absolutely despise Obama. Obama was the one who, he said, no, this is not a good idea at all to send lethal weapons to this war. This is an existential war for Russia. It's not an existential war for the United States. There's no reason for us to risk a war with Russia. So we're not going to send lethal weapons. And yet Trump was the one who sent them, and he's still boasting about it. He's still saying that was such a great thing. Now, I know he's cut off military aid, and apparently he's cut off intelligence. The intelligence part, I think I'm a little skeptical of. I mean, I'm sure they're getting intelligence from the Americans by some indirect route. The Americans cooperate on intelligence with the British and the Australians and whatever. So the Ukrainians will still be getting intelligence from the Americans. But when it comes to that they've cut off military aid, well, pretty much all the American government spokesmen said, well, this is just a temporary thing, just in order that we can get the peace talks off the ground. So long as we can get peace negotiations off the ground, then apparently the ban on further arms shipments will be lifted, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if you've got peace negotiations taking place, then why would you be sending arms? So, but that's the line coming in. This is Keith Kellogg said this. The John Ratcliffe said this. I mean, this is the line they're all taking. That's, well, once it becomes clear from Zelensky that he's serious about peace negotiations, then arms can be sent. I don't know if that's going to happen, but if that's the line they're taking, then that's not too distant from the line of Macron, which is, well, we've got to keep sending arms to Ukraine even after a peace agreement has been signed. And Trump has said that and he was saying this before that disastrous meeting with Zelensky. Trump was saying that we're going to keep sending arms to Ukraine. It was just that it was so angry by that meeting that they suddenly put a stop on arms shipments. But in principle, that the idea that even though there are peace talks and even though there's a peace agreement, we can go on sending arms to Ukraine. That's Trump. That's Trump's thinking. Trump has never said, if you sign a peace agreement, then we're going to stop sending arms. It says very much that we're going to continue sending arms. It's just that this meeting in the Oval Office pissed him off so much, which again goes back to the issue we were talking about with the tariffs. Which, that either you're thinking strategically or you're just responding to this or that event on this or that day. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, if just because you were so pissed off with Zelensky's performance in the Oval Office, you made that decision. But in principle, you don't have a problem with continuing to send arms. That's not thinking strategically. Let me go back. Um, okay, Robert. Thank you so much, Robert, as always, for your generosity. Robert says, George, so your argument is that the wily Trump is not so much concerned to broker a peace as to swap European taxpayers for American taxpayers to fund the Ukraine war effort. It will simply now be the Europeans rather than the Americans who fund the purchase of US made weapons. I think that's right. I think you've absolutely summarized it perfectly. I think that's the plan. And I think that was always the Trump plan. Um, he has never had a real problem with NATO. I mean, he was never, he said nasty things about NATO in the past, even before he became president. But his objections to NATO were that the Europeans were not paying enough. That's his mentality. That basically, it's Uncle Sam is Uncle Sucker. The Americans were underwriting the European security. The Europeans were not coughing up enough money. And he said this repeatedly on about Ukraine. He's been saying it from 2022 on, that Americans are pouring in all this money, but we have a big, beautiful ocean between us and Russia, whereas the Europeans are next door. And I think that's what he wants. He wants the Europeans to foot the bill for assisting Ukraine, while America focuses on other things, which China, and again maybe the Middle East, because to me it sounds like there aren't any breaks on what he's doing in the Middle East. I think he's getting sucked into this into this war with all his recent belligerent statements on Gaza. Sounds to me like he's going to get sucked in. But definitely when it comes to China. So I think that's where you put it. Yeah, he wants the European taxpayers to pay for that war in Ukraine. So in other words, European taxpayers instead of American taxpayers. And the Europeans are going along with it. So in a way, we're kind of being treated to a charade. I mean, it's this fight between Americans and Europeans, and I've seen a number of these fights over the years. And ridiculous media coverage. Oh, this is the end of NATO. The Trump is betraying his allies and so on. But they're on the same page. And in fact, the Europeans, in the way that John Healey who in Washington said, "Hey, we're doing what you asked us to do." Yeah, that's it. We're doing what you asked us to do. You wanted us to raise defense expenditure to 5% of GDP. You wanted us to take over the funding of the war in Ukraine. We're doing it. How are we doing it? We're doing it by putting out this absolutely ridiculous, stupid claim that we're all under threat from Russia. That Russia is about to throw its hordes against the Europeans. We're basically lying and fooling the people, but all in a good cause, and Trump will be very happy. So yeah, I mean I think everyone is playing along with the Trump plan, and I think the breakup of NATO has been postponed for another day, as of course I knew it would be. Um, and then Laura says stocks will tell, but I think Europe is pushing for more autonomy. Well, they couldn't do so, but they're not going to get more autonomy because ultimately NATO is still run by the United States. So it's basically the NATO. I mean, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, SACEUR, is an American. That's always been the rule, and by the fact that he's an American means that is the integrated military command of NATO is run by the Americans. This is utter nonsense about Macron extending nuclear weapons to anyone else. Nobody is interested in that. Nobody is interested in that. Merz is saying that, but I think Merz is just speaking for himself. I really don't think Merz is going to survive for very long. I don't think the German people want to rely upon French nuclear weapons. So it's the Americans run NATO. Through NATO, the Americans control Europe, and the Americans are not going to give that up because that's what gives Americans the power, the ability to project power in the world. That's how they do it. If they were to give this up, then they would have to. Then suddenly they would be a regional power. They become a hemispheric power. Americans don't want to do that, but controlling the European continent makes them a global power. So they're not going to give that up. And so, but just there were threats to do so in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 80s, and it never came to anything. For that exact same reason, the Americans are not going to give up on NATO. Marx 2023 says, George, I don't agree that Russia is not a great power. America and the other 49 countries lost the arms race, the economic warfare. What have they lost? What arms race? Economic warfare failed. Once the war ends and losers on the Ukrainian side will be horrifying. No, I don't agree with you at all, obviously. Russia is very far from winning this war. I mean, we have to say that again. We've gone through this war. It's taken 3 years. It still hasn't. It still hasn't secured Donetsk. I mean, that's basically it. And it's been months now since they were going to take Pokrovsk. They haven't taken Pokrovsk. But the problem is also this: if you're a great power, then everyone has to be afraid of you, and everybody has to believe that if you use your force, you will use it decisively and inflict heavy defeat on your adversaries. That's what being a great power is. But the problem for Russia is it hasn't been able to do that in Ukraine. It suffered huge losses. So has Ukraine. But that's not really the issue. The issue is that NATO, and particularly the United States, have suffered no losses. They've done rather well. And they've been able to inflict heavy losses on Russia without losing any lives themselves. So that's not what a great power does. And therefore it's when you have a great power, then you're able to project power regionally, but above all outside your region. Well, Russia failed to project power to rescue Bashar al-Assad. It wasn't able to do that. And even within its own region, like the Caucasus, which used to be absolutely, that's a Russian sphere of influence. That's where it's Russia's backyard. It's not. It failed to do that with Armenia and Azerbaijan. So the point is, what this war has shown is not that Russia's not a great power. I mean, it could become that, but the problem was that in 2019, 2020, 2021, I think most people thought, well, Russia is a great power. You don't mess with Russia. I think that this war has damaged, I think, Russia's reputation. I'm not exactly happy about it. In fact, I'm very unhappy about it. But I don't think there's any reason just to kid ourselves. Anyway, Marty says Trump comments on one of your pet peeves, daylight saving hours. It's a 50-50 issue. I assume people would like to have more light later, but some people want to have more light earlier because they don't want to take their kids to school in the dark. Well, I think it's it's much better to have more light later, because then people can go out, get some fresh air, exercise, and do all sorts of things later in the day after work, Um, and so it makes a lot of sense to have that extra hour of daylight. I think it's I can't see anything worse than the it becoming pitch black, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I mean, it's the worst thing. The most awful thing. And everyone knows this, and everyone's wanted to end this for years and years, and it never gets done. I don't know how many times this has been promised, and it just never gets done. Um, so, anyway, where are we? Um, And then March 2023 says the tariffs should be strengthening, but the dollar is falling. The American economy is heading to recession. Inflation is heading higher. Trump's gold in America is not shining. Tariffs only work if you have subsidies. Well, tariffs do work. I mean, tariffs, the whole point of tariffs is that they protect your domestic industry, your domestic your farmers and so on. I mean, they can work, but they have to be done strategically, and they have to be done consistently. Through, that's how America became a great economic power. That's how Germany became a great economic power. But if you do it in a haphazard way, then they don't work. Inflation, I don't really know that it's you know tariffs don't cause inflation. I mean that's just people misunderstand this. Tariffs can raise some prices, and some prices will rise as a result, but other prices won't. That's the whole point of tariffs, is that the prices of imports will rise. If that happens, if incidentally the importers um, impose inflict the tariffs on the consumers. They may or may not. They may not do it. They may prefer to take a hit, absorb the tariffs, and leave the prices as they are because they want their products to be competitive. So it's by no means certain that just because of the tariff that you will pass the cost of the tariff onto the consumers. I'm not sure that they will do that. I mean, like the Chinese still want to have the edge in the American market, so I don't think they're going to pass the tariffs on to the consumers. But even if they did, it means only that certain prices will go up, but other prices will remain the same. That's not inflationary. I mean, inflation is something very different. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, and therefore the value of money is going down. That's what inflation is when the value of money is going down. And that happens when governments recklessly expand the monetary supply. That it's obvious. I mean, the more money there is, the more it loses value. And that's the cause of inflation. Tariffs don't cause inflation. Um, um, Mark says 250,000 Ukrainians to be deported from April by April the 1st. I don't think that's going to happen. I read that somehow they're going to. I don't think any Ukrainians are going to be sent back until after um, a peace agreement is signed, and I think that's going to be that may well be for some time yet. But I don't believe they're going to be sent back. And also, this is a classic case where I think the courts are going to step in. Say that you can't send people back who are in danger of getting killed. I mean, if there's a danger they're going to be sent to the front and get killed, then essentially you can't send them back. So I don't think that's going to happen. Um, uh, uh, um, Laura Ott says that about apropos of the tariffs, you can't come up with an investment plan if you have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. It's true. Tariff used this way are detrimental to foreign investment. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I mean that's just he's not doing it the tariffs in the way that you're supposed to. And yeah, that's right. You're going to have. He's trying to encourage foreign investment. But if well, you're going to lift the tariffs just like that on a whim, or impose the tariffs on a whim, then you're not going to attract foreign investment. Vic Shakapopoulos says, "Have you ever met Farage personally?" I haven't met him personally. I think my sister did, because I think um, they were they were among the founders of UKIP. That was his original party, the UK Independence Party. So I think that they were kind of they knew each other in the UKIP days, but then I think they had a falling out. But I personally have never met him. And Ivan Grozny says, I've personally met Farage. He's a funny guy, but I get the sense he's an egoist. I think he'll make deals to get to PM. I tend to agree that that's right. I'm not sure he's ever going to get to be prime minister, but in principle, I agree. Um, yeah, he's entertaining, and he has a persona that is likable. I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, when you think of politicians, um, you know, Trump has is likable because he's very funny. He's obviously. I mean, Tucker Carlson says he's just hilarious when you're around him, and you can even see that when he went at the rallies. I mean, his jokes are very funny. Even in his address the other day, the State of the Union, he's very funny. The whole Pocahontas thing is just very funny. Um, but it's very hard. I mean, there aren't many um, people who have a likable personality, and Farage has that. The famous thing about he's the person you want to have a pint with, and he's cultivated that. But it's no doubt true. I think people think, yeah, that's a great guy. If you meet him in the pub, you'll find him very entertaining. He'll be joking, telling good stories. He's someone you want to hang out with, and that's a rare gift for a politician. I can't think of too many politicians in America who come across as likable. Somebody that you want to spend time with. So, but Farage has that. Vic Shakapopoulos says the surreal fear mongering and warmongering to me looks like a preparation for a 1984 style militarization of oppression in Europe. The Russian menace is a smokescreen to change internal laws. That may well be. That may well be the path, because they're going to have to keep this up. Just just a couple of speeches isn't going to do it. If you're going to be serious, which means you're going to spend enormous amounts of money you don't have, and that means you're going to have to borrow and borrow and borrow to spend this money on your military. It has to go together with continually whipping up hysteria about Russia. And therefore, there will be crackdowns on speech, crackdowns in universities, crackdowns on in the media, all of which, because everywhere, and you saw it even in this speech of Macron's, the Russians are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're in your living room. They're on your TV screen, on your computer, everywhere you look. There's a Russian. So I think that absolutely that could well be where we're heading. It doesn't end well. Whipping up this fake, phony, fraudulent hysteria just in order to get the public to agree to spending lots and lots of money on a military that they don't need. There's no need for all this spending. No one is threatening Europe. No one is threatening France. I mean, you can't think of a time when Europe was more secure than it is now. No one is threatening Europe. It's a total lie, and it's being put forward in a very cynical way, and it's going to end badly. I really think when you do this, when you have an arms race, and this was said today by the, the Polish Prime Minister Tusk, said this is an arms race. We're gonna have an arms race against Russia. This is the same arms race that we had against the Soviet Union. We won that arms race against the Soviet Union. We're gonna win this one. So he's Donald Tusk. He's calling for an arms race. Now, if you have an arms race, that's a good chance that could just spill over into a war. a full-scale war. Arms races are never a great idea. I mean, it didn't. There wasn't the Cold War never broke out into an actual hot war, but it came close. There were times in the 1960s, Cuban Missile Crisis, and there was a crisis in the early 1980s when the West and the Soviet Union actually almost were at a shooting war. So arms races are not the way to bring about peace and stability, and yet that's what the Europeans are calling for, well, an arms race. And there are going to be people who are going to object to this, and they will be deemed um, Kremlin bots or Kremlin stooges, and who knows what measures are going to be taken against them. In Britain, where there's no political freedom at all, people may well and just end up in prison as traitors or spies, or they can pass any kind of emergency legislation that since Great Britain is effectively at war with Russia, that anybody who's criticizing the government must be a terrorist threat or a foreign agent or whatever. So yeah, this that could well be where we're going. Anne Marie asks, I wonder what you think of the article I posted yesterday about Kit Clarenberg about MI6 infiltrating Switzerland. If you had time to read it, I did read it, and I thought that was very interesting. I have to say, I didn't really know about this because Operation Gladio obviously was a big deal in a number of European countries, and particularly in Italy, in France. I mean, Operation Gladio was the idea that um, the Soviet Union could well invade Europe, and that once they invade Europe, and obviously they overcome the armies of NATO, then there has to be a resistance to Soviet occupation. And so what they were doing with this Operation Gladio was preparing the ground for the resistance to Soviet occupation, which meant that they were storing arms and ammunition and training all kinds of armies that would go into operation in the event of Soviet in the event of a defeat at the hands of the Soviet Union. So that what that meant was that arms were being funneled into various terrorist organizations. They were holding on to these arms caches that supposedly were only to be used against the Soviets. But of course, when you give arms to people, they're going to put them to use. And so these various groups, these kind of right-wing terrorist groups, were were the products of Operation Gladio, because they were the ones who managed to get their hands on explosives and guns and ammunitions, and therefore but I didn't know that Switzerland was involved, because I always assumed that Switzerland was a neutral state, and so Operation Gladio wouldn't apply to Switzerland, because if the Soviets were to invade, then they would obviously only invade NATO states, where NATO had kept its armed forces, so primarily Germany or Italy, the Benelux countries, France, whatever. But nobody would think, well, why would the Soviets invade Switzerland? So I have to say, I was just very surprised. I didn't know any of that he wrote about. So that was really interesting. Thank you, Anne Marie, for posting it. But I was surprised. I don't know. Did you know, Anne Marie, that Switzerland was part of the Operation Gladio? I don't know. It was odd. I thought that everyone just always kept their hands out of Switzerland. Even in World War II, Switzerland was both sides, the Allied and the Axis powers, respected Switzerland's neutrality. So that's why I was just surprised that this Operation Gladio was also in Switzerland. Um, uh, and Vic Shakopoulos says all of Trump's kids are Slavic, so maybe he has some affection for Russia in that aspect, at least. Well, I don't. I mean, yes. No, I think the one the Georgia peach, which has the daughter, the I forgot the name of the Georgia peach. So the daughter who he had with his second wife, she's not Slavic, but the ones that the two sons and the daughter by Ivana Trump. I mean, I guess they'd be half Slavic, but Czech. I mean, I think it'd be it's a stretch to say that if you're half Czech, that means you're going to be sympathetic to Russians. I mean, the Czechs have not exactly been very friendly toward the Russians and vice versa. So that's kind of a stretch. Baron is then, he's half Slovenian. But I mean, but all of Trump's children were basically brought up in the West. I mean, ethnically, I mean, you could say they were half Slavic. I don't see that there would be any particular sympathy for the Russians. But I think Trump may at some point in his career back in starting in the 1980s, may have thought about making some money in Russia, and that's always been a fantasy of many American entrepreneurs. That Russia is a kind of El Dorado. You can make a lot of money there, and I think Trump bought into that. But none of his attempts to make money in Russia ever really came to anything. But I think he did engage in some fantasy. Maybe he's going to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. He did take the beauty pageant to Russia in 2013. But I don't see any particular sympathy for Russia on his part. I'm sure he thinks Russia is a European power, and that there's no real reason to have any bad relations with Russia. I think he does come to it in a common sense point of view. That doesn't mean he's going to do any favors for Russia. I mean, if anyone thinks, any Russians think he's going to do some favors, no, I don't think he's going to do any favors. But he doesn't. But I think he just doesn't have that ideological hatred for Russia, which goes back, back to the days of the pogroms, going back to the days of the Bolsheviks, back to the days of the Cold War. That ideological hatred for Russia that pervades the American political establishment. Trump has none of that. I mean, I think he's a businessman. He's a pragmatist, and I think he's always looked at Russia in that pragmatic way. NKMRD says the vibe among people doesn't feel very nasty regarding countries like UK, France, and Poland. On the one side, there is some common factors with Ukraine. On the other side, regarding mass migration, EU trouble. If there's a scandal regarding another country, it's usually a 12-hour outrage. I think that's right. I haven't noticed any hostility among the European public towards Russia. What's happening now is something that is being artificially whipped up by the politicians, and we're suddenly getting these demonstrations, pro-Ukraine demonstrations, suddenly appeared out of nowhere. For 3 years, suddenly you see demonstrations, people with the flags and so on. This is obviously astroturf. This is clearly fake, phony. And there's going to be more of this as if this actually happens, if they actually do take seriously and continue with this path of increasing military expenditures. And that the big project, and as I say, I don't know how economically or financially feasible that is, given how the bond market has responded. But if they do continue, then yeah, there's going to be more and more of this of hysteria about Russia. Artificial, as I said, there's been no indication in any European country of any particular hostility towards Russia. Um, yeah. Uh, yeah. Laura Ott says, "I love my pessimism. It never disappoints." That's good. Yes, yes, you're absolutely right. Pessimism never disappoints. You know, you will never you'll never be let down if you're a pessimist. Um, and, where's it? Okay. Yeah, and then Anne Marie says, "I can see the likable and funny side of Trump, and I can imagine going for a drink with him and having great fun. But I also see the vile side of a narcissist and a demagogue, and somewhat rotten in his voice, to be honest. I don't, you know, maybe. Um, yeah, I mean, obviously there are the sides of him that are unappealing. I mean, and the sort of the grandiose pronouncements, which sometimes he means them as a joke, but then you think, is he really a joke? I mean, when he declares that he's greater than George Washington, greater than Abraham Lincoln, it really does get very annoying after a time. You can't go around just saying these things about yourself, um, and the fury that he vents against anyone, those who defies him is obnoxious. Um, he does have a quality of leader. There's no question. He is a leader. Um, he the we saw the quality of the man, I think, after the failure and disappointment of 2021, after the January the 6th. He came back. He came back even though he was threatened by criminal prosecution. There were all these criminal cases against him. There were the serious civil cases against him, seeking to bankrupt him. Then there was the assassination attempts and so on. I mean, he came back from all of that and prevailed. That requires a unique personality. I can't think of anyone in my lifetime who has a personality unique like his. Who can prevail against so many obstacles and not be collapsed and beaten down by the forces arrayed against you. Because remember, he could have, when you're facing 700 years in prison, and then people come to you and offer you, we can make these charges go away if you just promise that you're not going to run for president. He could have made everything go away if at any time in 2023, 2024 had said, I'll go away. I won't bother you again, but please make all these criminal charges go away. He didn't do that. So I think he's he's a special person, and I think people who are special, who are kind of very different from others, there are obnoxious sides of them. I mean, I think we can think of all sorts of people who are remarkable talents, but there's they are very obnoxious in many ways as well. So, anyways, Vic Shakapopoulos says there's a great 1972 film, Return from Africa, on Montana, where the protagonist says a line some people even believe that Switzerland is neutral. That's a good one. I like that. Return from Africa. Alain Tanner, he was an interesting director. He's made some interesting films. I haven't seen that. That's a good one. There's some people even believe that Switzerland is neutral. But yeah, I mean, I think that's true. But nonetheless, Switzerland was treated as neutral. Like there was allies of the Axis. They still it's Switzerland. And you remember in that film, The Grand Illusion, when they escape, La Grande Illusion, one of the great Jean Renoir classic, when they escape, the prisoners escape, and they're now in Switzerland territory, and then it says, "No, don't shoot." They're in Switzerland. That's it. You can't shoot them, even though they had escaped from prison. You can't shoot them. They're in Switzerland. That was the last line of the film. Don't shoot. They're in Switzerland. Anyway, and Robert says the problem with tariffs is that while they protect one industry, it always comes at the expense of another. The Austrians argue that it was tariffs against imported European manufactured goods which triggered the secession from the South. Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's hard to say. Again, it's I mean, there's no question. I mean, I think that um, the South was hard done by through the tariffs. But I'm not sure that was that. I mean, the Austrians, of course, would put that forward as the reason why they seceded. I don't think that's quite true, but that's still interesting theory. Anyway, my time is up, so thank you everybody who has joined me. Thank you for all of your questions, all very challenging thoughts and observations. Really enjoyed it. Then, we're going to do some more podcasts over the weekend. And then we're going to do the live stream with Peter on Monday. And then we'll have the my solo on Tuesday. And then, but before that, I have to deal with the dogs. And I have to say, I know this is appalling, and I know it shocks and horrifies you when you see the tip jar not filling up. But I do what I can. But that's my lot in life in dealing with these dogs. But anyway, thank you everybody who joined me. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your contributions to the tip jar. That's something to keep them happy. And we'll talk very soon. All the best. Good night. Thank you. Bye bye.